I was not supposed to survive what they did to me, not in spirit, not in pride, not in the silence they tried to bury me under. For years, I accepted my place, shrinking myself to fit the corner of a life others decided I should live, until the day came when I realized that every insult, every dismissal, every attempt to erase me had been building towards something far greater than even they could imagine. You may think you know how betrayal unfolds, how a man can be discarded by those closest to him. But what happened to me was different, and the truth of it will leave you questioning everything you believe about loyalty, about power, about who really holds the final word. Before we begin, I ask you to like this story, subscribe so you do not miss a single stage of what is coming, and leave a comment with your thoughts and where you are watching from, because the journey you are about to take with me will change the way you see respect, dignity, and the cost of being underestimated. I sat there stunned, realizing they had already planned everything without me, reducing me to a caretaker in the very house I had paid for, maintained, and kept alive with decades of labor. My living room was filled with the clutter of glossy travel brochures scattered across the coffee table. I watched as Preston and Marissa leaned close together, laughing at pictures of golden beaches and endless ocean views. Joanne's voice chimed in about how much she looked forward to snorkeling, and Howard, holding one of the brochures as though it was already his itinerary, claimed he could not wait to see the Hawaiian sunsets. Their excitement was palpable, and yet it left me hollow, standing as an outsider in my own home. What made it worse was that Joanne was 64 and Howard was 61, both older than me, but somehow they were the chosen companions. I remember reaching for one of the brochures, thinking perhaps if I looked through it, I could imagine the sand beneath my feet or the breeze on my face. But before my fingers could even touch the paper, Preston's hand intercepted mine. He smiled, the kind of polite smile children use when they're convinced they know better than their parents. And he told me gently but firmly that I was too old for such adventures, that I would be better off staying behind to watch the house. The words cut like ice, because they were not just an opinion. They were a sentence, a declaration that my usefulness extended only as far as the walls of my own home. Joanne chuckled, lifting her coffee cup in a mock toast, and Howard grinned in agreement. In that instant, I did not feel like a father or a host. I felt like a servant, a man tolerated until his role was no longer necessary. I thought of Sarah, my late wife, who had been gone for 5 years now. She would never have allowed this to happen. She would have stood up for me, reminded Preston that family included all of us, not just the ones they found convenient. With her gone, the ties that once bound us had frayed into something unrecognizable. Marissa was glowing, her laughter sharp as glass, and I could not help but remember the days when I welcomed her into the family, eager to see my son happy. Now she sat there, her manicured fingers flipping through the glossy pages of tropical resorts, acting as if I were already fading into irrelevance. Preston leaned closer to her, pointing out activities, helicopter tours, and private dinners on the beach, their heads bent together as if the world belonged only to them and their chosen companions. I stood silent, my heart heavy. The house was mine, bought with years of teaching algebra and saving every penny, but in their eyes it was already theirs, an inheritance waiting to be claimed. When I finally rose to my feet, my knees ached, a reminder of my 62 years, but I forced myself to walk steadily toward my bedroom. Each step echoed against the hardwood floor, the same floor Sarah and I had danced on for our 30th anniversary. That memory felt like it belonged to someone else now, someone who still believed in family unity. As I reached my doorway, I heard Preston's voice call out, lighter now, telling Marissa that the trip was a family thing. The word family twisted in my chest like a knife. How easily they had carved me out of their definition of family, excising me as though I were nothing more than an inconvenience. In my bedroom, I caught my reflection in Sarah's old vanity mirror. A man stared back at me, his hair graying at the temples, his eyes lined with years of sacrifice, his mouth set in a hard line that spoke of disappointment more than anger. I saw a man who had given everything to his son, who had opened his home to keep them safe, who had spent his retirement funds to cover their debts, and who had asked for nothing but respect in return. And yet here I was told I was too old to matter. I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty space where Sarah's reading chair had once sat, remembering how she would look up from her book and smile at me. Her absence weighed on me more in that moment than ever before, because I knew if she were here, none of this would be happening. Downstairs, their voices rose with excitement. They were planning helicopter tours, snorkeling adventures, sunset dinners by the ocean, while I sat alone in silence. It was not just exclusion, it was erasure. They had erased me from the picture of their lives, leaving me behind like a piece of furniture too worn out to take along. Their laughter floated up through the walls, but it no longer sounded like joy to me. It sounded like betrayal. Something shifted inside me then. I could feel it, as sharp as the first cold snap of winter. They thought they were clever, that I would simply accept my role as caretaker, but they had underestimated me. While they planned for paradise, I was beginning to plan something else entirely. They believed I was too old, too trusting, too weak. At first the sound were muffled, but then Preston's voice rose clearer through the vent near my feet, the heating system carrying every syllable like a cruel gift. I froze, my hand tightening around the closed book, as I heard him say I had actually believed their excuse about being too old for adventure. My stomach twisted. Marissa's laugh followed, light and dismissive, and she said I had always been gullible, reminding Preston about how I had once believed they would pay me back for the roof repairs. Their laughter rang out again, not warm family laughter, but mocking and cruel, a reminder that the kindness I had offered them had turned into a joke at my expense. My instincts as a teacher kicked in. 30 years in classrooms had trained me to know when to listen and when to act, and I knew this was a listening moment. I lowered myself closer to the vent, my ear hovering just above it, and their words grew clearer, each one carving deeper into me. Then I heard Joanne's voice, calm and businesslike, mentioning that once they returned from Hawaii, they would move me into a nursing home called Sunset Manor. Howard chimed in, saying they could pay the deposit up front to secure a spot, $3,000 to make sure I was settled quickly. Preston's voice followed with excitement, asking how much the house could fetch once I was gone. $800,000, maybe more, Marissa answered, saying she had already contacted an agent named Clarissa Doyle to handle the sale. She said it like she was already the owner, already spending the money, already dividing what was mine. My chest tightened, my breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I thought I might collapse right there by the vent. I gripped the windowsill to steady myself, my knuckles whitening as the truth settled in. They had not only excluded me from a vacation, they had mapped out my disposal, treating me as an obstacle to be managed. Howard laughed, calling me demanding for always wanting to be included, while Joan agreed, saying it was time for me to accept my place. The entitlement in their voices dripped like poison, and every word landed like another strike against the years I had given them. I sat back slowly, my legs shaking under the weight of what I had heard. My mind raced with memories of the years since Sarah had passed, of how easily they had moved in, filling every room of my home with their belongings, eating my food, using my electricity, driving my car, all while I paid the bills. I remembered the groceries, the utilities, the repairs after the storm, the countless expenses I had covered without complaint because I believed family meant sacrifice. But now I could see those sacrifices for what they were: leverage they used against me, proof of my weakness in their eyes. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. They had never planned to repay me. They had never planned to leave. To them, I was nothing more than a stepping stone to their own comfort, a man to be pushed aside when he had served his purpose. My heart pounded in my ears, the heat of anger mixing with the sting of betrayal. I rose from the floor and walked to my dresser, opening the bottom drawer where Sarah's jewelry box sat. Inside, beneath her wedding ring, lay the deed to this house. My hands trembled as I lifted it, staring at the document that proved ownership, that reminded me this home had been built with my sweat and Sarah's love, not theirs. As I looked at it, my reflection stared back at me from the vanity mirror, and I realized something had shifted inside me in those minutes of eavesdropping. I was no longer invisible, no longer the quiet father willing to be erased. They thought they had me cornered, but I still held the deed, the title, the final say. I placed the box back carefully, sitting again on the bed's edge, and I knew sleep would not come. The voices downstairs had faded as they drifted to another part of the house, but their words clung to me like barbed wire. I thought of Sarah again, how she would have fought for me, how she would never have allowed them to speak of me that way. I remembered the exact night when Marissa had called me, her voice trembling through the phone, telling me that everything had collapsed. Preston's voice had come in faintly in the background, choked with panic, admitting he had made mistakes he could not undo. They had been drowning in debt, nearly $50,000 from online gambling, failed investments in cryptocurrency, and credit cards stacked to the ceiling. They were losing their house. Their car had been repossessed, and they claimed they had no one else to turn to. I can still hear the desperation in Preston's words, the way he said they would be homeless with 2 children if I did not help. Sarah had been gone only a few months by then, and the house felt unbearably empty, the silence of her absence pressing in on me from every corner. When they came to me, crying and begging for help, I told myself this was what family did. I let them move in. I told myself it was temporary, that they just needed time to get back on their feet. I gave them not only a roof, but also my savings, taking money from my retirement account and paying bills they could not manage. I watched my pension, the one Sarah and I had carefully planned, disappear into their mistakes. But I swallowed the pain because I wanted to believe it was for the greater good. When the roof was damaged in a storm, they promised they would pay me back for the $14,000 it cost to repair, but I ended up covering alone. When the children needed new bicycles, I bought them, spending my own money and doing the assembly myself while Preston stayed inside, saying he was too busy searching for work online. When their insurance lapsed, I paid the medical bills. When the car broke down, I paid for the repairs. When the fridge needed replacing, I paid for that too. It all piled up, page after page, in a little notebook Sarah had once told me to keep, the one where I wrote down every expense so I would know where the money went. At first, it was only numbers, neat rows of figures, but over the years it became a ledger of sacrifice, proof of how much I had given. And yet, after everything, they still sat downstairs laughing about sending me to a nursing home. I thought about Sarah's words, how she had always believed in accountability, in making sure people understood the value of what they were given. She would tell me that even kindness required boundaries, and I realized with a painful clarity that I had let those boundaries slip away. I had allowed them to believe that everything I gave was endless, that my patience and my generosity had no limits. But I knew better now. I could see the calculation behind their desperation all those years ago, how Preston had known exactly which buttons to push, the grieving widower with an empty house and a generous heart. They had leaned on my love for my grandchildren, used it to their advantage, knowing I would do anything to keep those children safe. I do not regret caring for the children because they were innocent in all of this, but I regret the way their parents twisted my kindness into something they felt entitled to. 5 years of free housing, 5 years of grocery bills, 5 years of utilities doubled, 5 years of constant demands and promises that things would get better. But things had not gotten better. They had simply learned how to take more. And now, they were not even ashamed to plot against me. They believed I was so blind, so trusting, that I would never see it coming. I leaned forward in my chair by the window, staring out into the backyard where the swing set I had bought still stood, glinting faintly under the moonlight. I remember the day I set it up, sweating in the Florida heat, tightening every bolt with my aching hands because Preston had not been around to do it himself. I remembered the way the children had laughed when they first climbed on it, and how that laughter had made the money and the effort feel worth it. But now, even those memories were tainted because their parents had poisoned everything with greed. My reflection in the glass looked back at me, and I realized how far I had allowed myself to sink under their weight. But I was not powerless. I had endured storms before, in life and in classrooms where discipline and patience were the only tools I had to guide unruly students. And I realized that my son and his wife had become nothing more than unruly children in grown bodies, spoiled by years of undeserved comfort. They had confused my silence for ignorance, my sacrifices for weakness, and my love for submission. That mistake would be their undoing. My hands trembled slightly as I closed Sarah's jewelry box with the deed to the house tucked safely inside. That document was more than proof of ownership. It was proof of my authority, my ability to act, my right to decide. The betrayal I had overheard still pulsed in my veins like a second heartbeat, and I could not shake the echo of their laughter as they plotted my future without me. They believed I was a burden, a man to be tucked away and forgotten, but they had no idea that in their arrogance they had awakened something far stronger than they expected. I had spent the long night cataloging every sacrifice, every slight, and now the clarity of what I must do was undeniable. I listened to the sounds of the house waking up, Preston moving about upstairs, Marissa bustling in the hallway, Joanne and Howard already in the kitchen discussing flight details, their voices bubbling with the excitement of people who believed they had secured everything they ever wanted. The sight of their suitcases stacked neatly by the door was confirmation of the opportunity one had been handed. They were leaving me alone, assuming I would guard their inheritance for them. But in truth, the moment they stepped out that door was the moment the balance of power would shift. I kept my face calm when I joined them, sipping coffee as though I was nothing more than the obedient caretaker they believed me to be. I even offered to drive them to the airport, and they accepted without hesitation, Bradley cracking a joke about saving money on Uber while Marissa laughed in agreement. I smiled politely, saying nothing, though inside my chest a fire burned at how easily they took my help for granted. The drive to the airport was filled with chatter, their voices rising in harmony about excursions and oceanfront dinners, their plans unfolding with the ease of people who had no worries, no responsibilities, because I had carried them all. I kept my eyes on the road, answering when spoken to but otherwise silent, letting them believe what they wanted to believe. When we arrived, they unloaded their bags quickly, Preston clapping me on the shoulder as if to thank me, though his eyes carried none of the warmth of true gratitude. Marissa gave me a quick kiss on the cheek. Rehearsed affection meant more for appearance than sincerity, and Joanne and Howard both waved with cheerful arrogance, their faces glowing with anticipation. I watched them disappear into the terminal, their laughter echoing in the air, and I did not feel sorrow as I once might have. Instead, I felt relief because now the house was mine again, at least for a short time, and with that solitude came freedom. When I drove back, the emptiness of the house struck me differently than before. For years, it had been filled with their belongings, their demands, their noise. Now, it was silent, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt the space breathe. I walked through each room, my steps deliberate, my eyes no longer seeing furniture and photographs, but assets and opportunities. Everything looked different under the light of betrayal. This house was not just a home anymore. It was leverage, a key to justice, the one tool I still had in my possession. I walked into my bedroom and opened Sarah's jewelry box again, pulling out the deed and holding it tightly, reminding myself of the truth. They had no claim, no authority, no rights. They had confused my generosity with surrender. But this house was mine, bought with my teaching salary and Sarah's sacrifices, a lifetime of work that they had tried to erase with a casual laugh. Not anymore. I sat down at the kitchen table with the phone in front of me, my hand hovering above it. I remembered the name I had overheard Marissa mention to Joanne. Clarissa Doyle, a real estate agent she had already contacted behind my back. The irony brought a grim smile to my face. She believed she would use Clarissa to sell my house after they locked me away, but now I would use Clarissa for my own plan. I dialed her number, and when she answered with professional warmth, I introduced myself as Lawson Mercer, the rightful owner of the property at 847 Maple Street. I told her I needed to sell quickly, 2 weeks at most, and I was prepared to price aggressively for a fast cash sale. There was a brief pause, the kind of silence where you can almost hear someone weighing opportunity, and then her tone sharpened with interest. No mortgage? She asked. Clear title? Yes, I told her, every word measured, every fact true. Her enthusiasm grew, and she said she could be at the house within the hour. I agreed, my voice steady, though inside I felt the strange exhilaration of a man who had just stepped into uncharted territory. When I hung up, I looked around at the photographs still hanging on the walls, at Sarah's Garden certificates and my teaching awards, at the remnants of the life that had once felt safe. I felt grief, yes, but I also felt something else, something that had been buried for too long. Control. For years, I had been reacting to their needs, their failures, their schemes. For years, I had let their demands dictate my life. But now, with one phone call, I had turned the tables. They had thought me weak, but weakness does not pick up a phone, weakness does not plan, weakness does not act. And I was acting. True to her word, Clarissa arrived within the hour, dressed in a navy blazer despite the Florida heat, her tablet and measuring tape in hand, the sharpness of her presence matching the sharpness of my intent. She walked through the house, noting details, admiring the refinished hardwood floors, the updated kitchen, the new roof. She spoke of market value, comparables in the neighborhood, the speed at which properties were moving. I listened carefully, absorbing every word, nodding when necessary, but all the while I was thinking of Preston and Marissa on their plane, sipping complimentary drinks, believing they were clever. If only they knew. It reminded me that the space was mine and mine alone, and that I still had the power to choose its future. Clarissa had promised she would begin making calls immediately, and true to her word, my phone rang the very next morning with her voice brisk and efficient, telling me she had already lined up a potential buyer interested in cash purchases. I felt the familiar tightening of my chest, not from fear, but from a strange exhilaration that carried me forward. This was happening quickly, and that was exactly what I wanted. I walked through each room of the house with a different set of eyes now, no longer seeing furniture or clutter, but assets to be measured, features to be highlighted, selling points to be leveraged. The refinished hardwood floors Sarah and I had insisted on maintaining, the modern kitchen we had saved for years to afford, the sturdy roof replaced only 5 years earlier. These were no longer just reminders of our life. They were tools that would make the sale inevitable. My grief did not vanish. but it took a new shape, becoming fuel for action. If I was to lose the house, it would not be because they forced it from me. It would be because I chose to turn it into something they could never reclaim. When Clarissa returned later that afternoon with her clipboard and measuring tape, I followed her as she moved from room to room, noting details, taking photographs, asking pointed questions. She spoke about cash buyers who valued speed and certainty above all else, people who did not quibble over inspection reports or contingencies, people who wanted properties they could flip or rent out quickly. She told me that for such buyers, the most important factors were clear title, immediate availability, and willingness to price realistically. I told her I was ready for all of it. She looked at me for a long moment, perhaps sensing the unusual urgency in my voice, but she did not pry. Business was business, and she was eager to secure her commission. That evening, as I ate dinner alone for the first time in what felt like years without the noise of Preston complaining about bills or Marissa critiquing the meals, I let myself savor the calm. I pictured them on a beach in Maui, sipping drinks with Joanne and Howard, laughing about how they had tricked me, never suspecting that while they toasted their future, I was dismantling the very foundation of their security. The irony filled me with a cold satisfaction. They thought they had me pinned, but they had no idea I was already in motion. The next morning, Clarissa called again, her tone sharper, more excited. She told me she had spoken with a serious investor, someone who made cash offers regularly, and that he wanted to see the property within days. She reminded me that such buyers often expected a discount in exchange for speed, but I did not hesitate. I told her I would accept less if it meant closing before my family returned. My voice did not waver when I said it, though I could almost hear Sarah's voice in my memory, warning me to be careful with money. But this was not only about money. It was about dignity, about making sure Preston and Marissa understood what it meant to underestimate me. If it cost me $60,000 to teach them the value of respect, then it would be a lesson worth every cent. Clarissa arranged the showing, and when the potential buyer arrived, a woman named Elaine Monroe in her 50s with confident posture and eyes that scanned everything as though she had already claimed it, I knew immediately she was the type who did not waste time. She asked direct questions about square footage, roof age, kitchen upgrades, neighborhood demographics. She was not here to dream about a family home. She was here to calculate profit, and that was exactly what I needed. I answered every question with precision, listing dates and costs, providing documents Clarissa had prepared, and making it clear that I was ready to move fast. Elaine nodded approvingly, her expression betraying interest, but she remained guarded. She left after half an hour, promising to have an answer within 24 hours. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of anticipation keeping me awake. I knew the offer would come. It was just a matter of how low it would be. I also knew I would accept it, no matter what, because the outcome was worth far more than the money I might lose. They had built their plan on the belief that I would be passive, that I would accept their judgment. But every page of Sarah's expense notebook, every entry detailing what I had covered for them, whispered to me in the dark that it was time to act. That speed was what I needed most, because every step forward meant one step closer to ensuring Preston and Marissa returned not to comfort, but to consequences. I sat at the table with Clarissa the following morning, the deed and my identification laid out between us, while she tapped figures into her tablet and explained the timeline. 7 to 10 days, she said, possibly less if Elaine expedited the process. My heart beat faster at her words because I knew 7 days was well before Preston and Marissa would fly back from Maui. They thought they had 2 weeks of freedom, but their own extension of the trip had unknowingly given me the perfect window. Elaine herself came back 2 days later, dressed in crisp clothes that spoke of efficiency, her eyes scanning the property again with cool calculation. She was not sentimental, not even slightly, and as she walked through each room, her questions remained clipped and to the point. What year was the roof replaced? When had the kitchen been renovated? How old was the HVAC? She did not ask about memories. She did not care about family photographs or anniversaries. She cared about numbers, about return on investment, and that was exactly why she was the perfect buyer for me. I answered everything honestly, every date and cost still fresh in my mind because of how much I had invested, both financially and emotionally. I watched her nod as she typed notes, her expression betraying nothing, but I knew she was satisfied. When she left, Clarissa pulled me aside and whispered that Elaine was ready to make things move faster if I would agree to waive any additional contingencies. I did not even hesitate. I told her to accept. Later that night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, I thought again about what this meant. Selling this house was not only a financial decision. It was a statement, a declaration that I would no longer let them define me. They had sat in this very living room and laughed about how they would send me to a nursing home and claim my house. But now, with each signature, I was tearing their plan apart. I remembered the way Preston's hand had intercepted mine when I reached for the brochure about Hawaii, the way he had smiled at me like I was a child needing gentle correction. That same hand would return from Hawaii empty, grasping for something already gone, and in that thought, I found peace. The next morning, Clarissa called again, her voice tinged with excitement, telling me Elaine's firm wanted to close even faster than planned. They were prepared to add an additional $10,000 above their original offer if I could be ready in 7 days rather than 10. I sat silently for a moment, letting the information sink in before I agreed. More money was welcome, though the real gift was time. 7 days meant I would be done before Preston and Marissa even set foot back in Florida. I pictured them still lounging on the beach, ordering expensive meals on credit, convinced their future was secured, while I quietly dismantled every illusion they had built. The paperwork arrived quickly, each page requiring my initials, my signature, my careful attention. Clarissa explained every line, every clause, and I signed with a steady hand, the pen gliding across the paper with the same precision I once used to grade algebra exams. Each stroke felt like justice, not vengeance, but the quiet balance of a ledger long overdue. By the time we finished, the deal was officially underway, and Elaine's attorneys were already working on transferring funds and clearing title. When Clarissa left, I sat alone in the kitchen again, staring at the stack of documents, and I realized how calm I felt. There was no fear, no doubt, only the certainty that I had chosen the right path. For years, I had let Preston and Marissa make decisions for me by default, their failures forcing my hand, their demands dictating my choices. But not anymore. Now, every step was mine. I had taken control, and in doing so, I had reminded myself of who I truly was. I was not a burden. I was not disposable. I was a man who still had power. I rose from the table and walked into the living room, looking at the empty spaces where boxes had already been packed, where memories had once hung on walls and photographs had once smiled back at me. Soon all of it would belong to someone else, strangers who would treat the house not as inheritance, but as an investment. And that was better. It was justice, because the people who had treated my generosity as entitlement no longer deserved to live in the comfort I had built. I thought of Sarah again, her voice echoing in my memory, reminding me that kindness without boundaries is simply weakness. For years, I had mistaken the two, believing that my sacrifices would teach Preston and Marissa gratitude. But they had not learned gratitude. They had learned greed. And now, with the stroke of a pen and the quiet efficiency of a cash buyer, I was teaching them the lesson they had avoided for far too long. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat at the table, listening to the silence of the house, a silence that no longer felt lonely but triumphant. The deal was in motion, the clock was ticking, and with each passing day, I grew closer to the moment when they would return expecting everything to be the same, only to find that everything had changed. I smiled at the thought, not out of malice, but out of relief. For once, I was not waiting for life to happen to me. I was making it happen. The thought filled me with both dread and determination, because every corner of the house was stuffed with 5 years of accumulated belongings, evidence of their entitlement and laziness. I woke up early the next morning, the sun barely peeking through the blinds, and I made a list of tasks in the same methodical way I used to prepare lesson plans as a teacher. Order moving services, purchase boxes, arrange storage, label everything clearly so there would be no confusion when the day of reckoning arrived. By mid-morning, I had already called a professional moving company and secured a unit at a nearby storage facility, prepaying 6 months of rent so that when Preston and Marissa returned, they would have access to everything they had left behind, though not under the roof they had once taken for granted. The movers arrived the next day, a pair of sturdy men with quiet professionalism, and I directed them through the house with steady authority. We started with Marissa's things in the upstairs bedroom, where racks of expensive clothing filled the closet, many items still with tags on them, purchased with the grocery money I had stretched thin. Each blouse, each pair of shoes, each piece of jewelry I had given her for holidays and birthdays went carefully in a labeled boxes. I handled some of the garments myself, folding them with the same care I had once shown when helping Preston pack for college, though now the act carried no warmth, only closure. From there, we moved on to Preston's belongings, his gaming consoles, an endless stack of electronics, the books on cryptocurrency and gambling that mocked me with their false promises, the broken tools borrowed from my garage and never returned. The movers worked efficiently, boxing and loading each piece, while I kept a meticulous inventory, making certain that everything was accounted for. When we reached Joanne and Howard's room, I instructed the movers to handle the items with special care, because though my resentment ran deep, I refused to allow cruelty to dictate my actions. Their medications, important documents, and expensive luggage were carefully organized, packed neatly, and recorded. Even in their betrayal, I would not stoop to their level, because my actions were not about revenge for the sake of spite, but about justice and dignity. I wanted them to see that I had not lost myself in their cruelty, that I still maintained discipline and order even as I removed them from my life. By late afternoon, the truck was nearly full, and we drove to the storage facility where Rosa, the manager, greeted us with a friendly smile and walked me through the rental agreement. She asked if I was downsizing, and I told her simply that I had planned this for a long time. It was not a lie, for though the exact circumstances had crystallized only in the past week, the truth was that 5 years of quiet endurance had prepared me for this moment. I prepaid the unit with 6 months' rent in cash, handed her an envelope with every dollar counted carefully, and then directed the movers as they stacked the boxes inside. Watching each box disappear into the cavern of the unit was strangely cathartic, as though with each load, I was unloading the weight that had sat on my shoulders for too long. When the final box slid inside, I handed Rosa the keys, telling her that someone from my family would eventually collect the belongings, though I suspected it would be much sooner than they expected. As the movers secured the unit and locked the heavy door, I felt something inside me shift, a sensation of closure more powerful than any conversation could have provided. I thought of Sarah again, her words about knowing where money went, her insistence that we track our sacrifices so they would never be wasted. I realized then that I was not just moving objects. I was moving years of entitlement, Years of being taken for granted, years of watching my generosity curdle into their arrogance. Each box was proof of my effort, and each box being removed was proof that I was reclaiming my space. That evening, I returned to the house, and for the first time in half a decade, it felt almost empty. The rooms echoed with my footsteps, and though the walls still held memories, the clutter was gone, replaced by a clean stillness that belonged to me alone. My own belongings remained: Sarah's photos on the mantle, my teaching certificates on the wall, the books that had shaped my thinking stacked neatly on the shelves. Everything else was gone, boxed and stored, stripped of its power to suffocate me. I stood in the living room where Preston and Marissa had once sat plotting my erasure, and now the room was bare, sunlight spilling across hardwood floors that Sarah and I had polished ourselves years ago. I smiled faintly because it no longer felt like their inheritance. It was my choice, my decision, and soon it would be gone from all of us, turned into the final lesson they never expected. But I also knew that in only a few days the house would no longer belong to me at all. And that was a truth I had accepted with clear certainty. Selling it was not surrender, but a deliberate act of reclamation. The transformation of what they believed was their prize into the very weapon that would dismantle their arrogance. Still, even knowing the justice of it, I could not remain in the space much longer. The house was an empty shell now, its purpose finished, and I needed a new place that belonged to me alone. So I found a modest apartment across town, a small one-bedroom with a kitchenette and just enough room for my books, Sarah's photographs, and the few possessions I had decided to keep. When I signed the lease and took the keys, I felt lighter, as if I had finally put down a burden I had carried for too long. Moving into the apartment was simple because I had so little left. I carried in a suitcase of clothes, a box of books, Sarah's jewelry box with a deed that would soon be obsolete, and a few framed photographs. I set my teaching certificates along one wall, lined my books carefully on a single shelf, and placed Sarah's picture on a small table near the window. The room was not grand, but it was peaceful, and as I arranged my few belongings, I realized I had not felt this kind of control over my environment in years. No one barged in demanding money. No one left dirty dishes for me to clean. No one used my utilities without thanks. It was mine, entirely mine, and that realization filled me with a quiet strength. That evening, as I sat in my new chair drinking a cup of coffee I had brewed for myself alone, the phone rang. The caller ID displayed a Hawaii area code, and I knew immediately it was them. I let the phone ring twice before I answered, my voice calm and steady, as though nothing unusual was happening. It was Preston, his tone bright and carefree, telling me how wonderful the resort was, how the children were laughing, how the beach was everything they dreamed. He spoke as if nothing had changed, as if I were still sitting at home, waiting faithfully for their return. I responded warmly, telling him I was glad they were safe, that I hoped they took plenty of pictures, my voice betraying none of the truth about what I had already done. When Marissa's voice chimed in from the background, saying they had a little surprise for me when they returned, I smiled silently because I knew her surprise was the plan to place me in a nursing home. I told them in a measured tone that I too was working on a surprise, something important that would change everything for all of us. Preston laughed, dismissive, asking what kind of business I could possibly be handling in retirement, but I did not let my voice waver. I told them that when they came home, they would understand. After the call ended, I placed the phone face down on the table and looked around at the apartment again. This was not the house where Sarah and I had dreamed of growing old, but it was mine now, untainted by betrayal. In the silence, I felt her presence more strongly than I had in years, as though she approved of the steps I was taking, as though she had been waiting for me to reclaim my dignity. I knew she would have fought for me if she were alive, but since she was not, it was my duty to fight for myself. The days that followed were filled with preparation. Clarissa brought me more documents to review, and each time I signed, I felt another chain breaking free. Elaine's firm was pushing to close in record time, and the momentum was exhilarating. At night, I would sit in my small apartment, sipping coffee or tea, watching the quiet street below, and I felt a calm I had not known in half a decade. I did not miss the chaos of my son's household filling my home. I did not miss the constant demands for money or the complaint about bills. I did not miss being invisible. In this modest apartment, I was seen by myself, and that was enough. One evening, the phone rang again, Marissa's voice soft and falsely sweet as she asked if I was managing all right, if I was eating properly, if I had remembered to take my medicine. The hypocrisy nearly made me laugh. I told her I was fine, that I was keeping busy, that she should focus on her vacation. She warned me not to overexert myself, as if I were a child who could not be trusted to handle his own affairs. I promised her that I was doing just fine and that she would see soon enough. When the call ended, I stared at the dark screen and shook my head at the irony. They were worried about me overexerting myself, but I was already dismantling the very life they depended on. The Mercer home was legally in new hands, and I was free. I spent that morning sipping coffee in my window, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside, marveling at how ordinary everything seemed despite the extraordinary shift in my life. When Preston and Marissa's plane landed, I knew they still believed they would walk into their inheritance, into the comfort they had been waiting to seize. They had no idea the rug had already been pulled from beneath them. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed with a call from Preston. His voice sounded impatient, the thin veneer of politeness cracking as he asked where I was because the locks had been changed. He said they had been standing outside for 20 minutes, trying their keys, confused and embarrassed as the neighbors peeked curiously through their curtains. I let him speak, his voice growing more frantic, Marissa's shrill complaints in the background, before I finally told him the truth. Calmly, I explained that the house no longer belonged to me, that I had sold it during their absence, and that I now lived in a different space. There was silence, thick and disbelieving, followed by a sputtering of words that collided in anger. He demanded an explanation. He shouted about betrayal. He cried about how could I do this to them, and through it all my voice remained steady. I told him I had given them more than enough chances to treat me with dignity, and since they refused, I had chosen dignity myself. When the call ended, I pictured their faces red with outrage, their luggage still on the porch, their vacation glow replaced with shock. I imagined Marissa pacing furiously, Joanne and Howard bewildered, the children confused as to why they could not go inside. And though part of me felt sorrow for the children caught in the middle, a stronger part felt justice settling over me like a cloak. I had not acted out of malice, but necessity. And the truth was that they needed to learn the consequences of their cruelty. For the first time in years, I felt I had spoken with my full voice, not as the quiet father left behind, but as the man reclaiming his place. Later that evening, Elaine called to inform me that Preston had stormed into her office demanding answers, only to be shown the signed deeds, the legal documents, the checks already cleared. There is nothing he could do, no loophole to exploit, no reversal to hope for. She said his fury filled the room, but beneath it she saw the panic of a man realizing he had miscalculated everything. She asked if I wanted her to handle any further contact, but I told her no. I wanted to face them myself, not with anger, not with spite, but with the quiet strength of someone who had finally taken control. The next morning, Preston came to my apartment. He knocked hard, his voice trembling as he called my name, and when I opened the door, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Behind his anger was desperation, the realization that his safety net had been cut. He accused me of cruelty, of destroying his family's future, of choosing revenge over love. I listened without interrupting, my eyes steady on his face, and when he finally ran out of accusations, I told him the truth. I reminded him of every time he had dismissed me, every time Marissa had mocked me, every time I'd been treated as less than human in my own home. I told him love without respect is not love at all, and that I had chosen to stop living as their servant. His eyes wavered, but he did not apologize. He could not. Instead, he stormed away again, slamming the door so hard the walls shook, but I remained standing tall in the silence that followed. That night, alone in my apartment, I sat with Sarah's photograph in my hands. I spoke to her softly, telling her what had happened, telling her how they had returned to find the world reshaped, telling her how I had finally chosen myself. The apartment glowed in the soft light of a single lamp, and I felt her presence warm around me, as though she were proud. For the first time in years, I did not feel alone. I felt whole. The days following their return became a mirror of my past and a contrast to my present, because for years I had lived in silence, swallowing the small humiliations they gave me, while now I spoke with clarity and refused to be diminished. My son Preston no longer called as often, his messages dwindling from furious accusations to strained silences, and Marissa did not bother reaching out at all, her pride too wounded to admit her role in her own downfall. Joanne and Howard had tried once to approach me, stopping me in the parking lot of the grocery store, their voices soft and pleading, their words painting me as cruel and heartless. But I looked them in the eye and told them I had simply done what any man with dignity left would do. They turned away, realizing nothing could be undone, and I walked away lighter than I had felt in decades. Elaine told me the new owners had moved in smoothly, bringing warmth and laughter to the house, and for the first time in years that home was no longer tainted with tension and disrespect. It belonged to people who valued it, and knowing that brought me peace. I began building a new routine, not grand or luxurious, but deeply mine. In the mornings, I brewed coffee and sat by the window of my apartment, watching the city stir to life. I joined a community group at the library, people my age who gathered to share stories, exchange books, and laugh without judgment. For years, I had been told I was a burden, someone fading, but here I was seen as an equal, a man with wisdom worth listening to. I even struck up a friendship with Dennis, the neighbor who had often waved to me politely, but whom I had ignored during my years of quiet despair. We shared meals, told stories of our youth, and sometimes simply sat in silence, grateful for companionship untainted by expectations. One evening, as I walked home through the cooling dusk, I passed by a father playing catch with his young son in a park. The boy's laughter echoed across the grass, and the father's smile was genuine, not forced or bitter. It made me think of Preston when he was small, how he once clung to my hand with trust and love before years of entitlement twisted our bond into something fragile. A pang of sadness touched me, but did not consume me. I understood now that love is only real when paired with respect. And if my son could not offer me that, then my role was no longer to chase after what was gone, but to nurture what remained within me. That understanding steadied my heart, teaching me that even broken ties could not erase the worth of who I was. Weeks turned into months, and I felt my life take shape again, slowly but firmly. I took up small projects, helping the library with repairs, lending my skills to neighbors who needed a steady hand. I became known as reliable, the kind of man people sought out not because they wanted something to exploit, but because they valued what I brought. And each evening, when I sat with Sarah's photograph on the nightstand, I spoke to her of these days, telling her of the small victories, the quiet joys, the strength I'd found. Sometimes I imagine her voice answering, telling me she was proud, telling me I had finally honored myself in a way I had long denied. The last time Preston visited, months after the sale, he looked older, tired, worn by his own choices. He did not yell this time, did not accuse, did not try to twist my actions into betrayal. Instead, he stood awkwardly at my door, his voice soft as he said he had not expected things to end this way. He did not apologize. Perhaps pride still held him back, but I saw in his eyes a flicker of recognition, a small crack in his armor. He realized at last that I was not the man he could control, not the father who would endlessly endure humiliation. I offered him a seat, and we spoke quietly, not as master and servant, not as tyrant and victim, but as two men separated by choices. The conversation ended with no resolution, no sweeping forgiveness, but there was an understanding, and that was enough. In the end, I had not only sold a house, I had freed myself from the weight of years spent in shadows. I had chosen to reclaim the dignity that no one can give or take away but me. The world had told me I was too old. My own family had told me I was a burden, but I discovered that as long as breath remains, a man can rise, a man can resist, a man can rebuild. I was no longer the forgotten figure in the corner, the overlooked guest in my own life. I was Lawson Mercer, 62 years old, a man who had endured betrayal and found his strength not in revenge, but in truth. When I walked through the city now, I held my head high. The strangers who passed by did not know my story, but I carried it with me, a reminder carved deep in my soul that dignity is never given freely, it is claimed. And I knew that somewhere beyond the horizon, Sarah was smiling, because the man she had loved had finally returned to himself. The end. I have told my story with every detail of pain, betrayal, and the strength it took to rise again. Now I turn to you, the ones who have walked through these chapters with me. If you felt the weight of what I carried, if you understood how easily dignity can be stolen and how hard it is to reclaim, then let your support show. I ask you to like this video, to subscribe so more voices like mine can be heard, and to share it with others who may need the reminder that age does not erase a man's worth. I want to know what you think of the plot that unfolded in my life. Did you see yourself in the way I endured? Did the choices I made at the end surprise you, or did you expect them all along? Tell me in the comments what struck you most and how you would have acted if you were in my place. And one more thing, where are you watching from? Each of you lives in a different place, facing different struggles, but perhaps you also know what it feels like to be overlooked and underestimated. Write it down. Let me see where these words have reached. I stand here as one man who reclaimed his dignity, but together, if we share, we are many.